I want to try to broaden the discussion even further. Thomas has done a wonderful job, I think, of showing us, and his book, which I had the opportunity to read before it's gone to press, I highly recommend that all of you do so, it's worth it. But he clearly shows that the narrow debate as to whether more debt or more growth or more jobs or more inflation or any narrow debate is to miss the wider context and the freedom of choice that we really have. And that's a very important message if we're thinking about further development of economics. I'd like to take that same argument still further and try to push the horizons of what we consider economics out to the boundaries of society itself. Many of the things I'm going to say I think are self-evident, but in contemplating solutions and to our social problems and to our economic problems, I think it's valuable to keep these things in mind, and especially when we're thinking about new theory. So I'm basically going to raise three questions. What are the factors that determine the limits to economic development? What determines the real value of money? What is the optimal distribution of social power, and how can it be achieved? And I'm not going to answer any of these three, but I'm going to try to suggest elements of the answers. And I was very grateful to Minister Silva this morning. For me, it was unexpected, for raising the issue of power right up front, because I think it's a critical element of this whole equation. First, a few observations. The modern economy is a social institution founded on an ever-expanding organization of human relationships. Sometimes we think of economy as what we're producing, or we think of money, we think of transactions, but the fundamentals of economy are human relationships. And the growth of economy over the millennium has been increasing the intensity and the quality and the organization of those relationships. And that's essentially what economy does for specific purposes. Like any social institution, economic institutions are intended to serve a purpose. As the value of democracy is measured in terms of the political freedom it gives to people, to everybody in the society, I'm arguing that the value of any economic system has to be looked at not in terms of its total production or GDP or wealth generation, but how far it really meets basic needs for human economic security, welfare, and well-being in a sustainable manner that provides for human dignity and maximum freedom. That's not how we may agree with the statement, but it's not how we are typically evaluating economic policy, economic performance. If we look at the performance of the world economy over the last 200 years, it's a fantastic story. Real per capita GDP has gone up about 12 times in spite of a more than 7-fold growth in population. It's hard to argue with success. And that's a powerful argument for those who feel that what we're already doing is good. Yet we all are aware of the signals. Poverty persists in spite of this, and the number of poor people is enormous because of the population growth. Unemployment is rising. We have widening inequality, and other factors that we are discussing here and elsewhere. We can interpret these as things that require a minor incremental changes in the existing system, or we can look at this in an evolutionary sense and say that the factors that have enabled us to grow and achieve this much are not, or the concepts that have enabled us to grow and achieve this much are not adequate to reach the optimal goals of society in future. We don't have to say, we can acknowledge the great achievements without saying that we have to be limited by the present course of action. And we're faced with a paradox today. We have on one side an abundance of unmet human needs measured in terms of poverty or unemployment or education and healthcare, however you want to do it. At the other side, we have a vast, underutilized resources that are not being used. Money, about 250 trillion that's circling the globe. We have excess production capacity. We have life-saving technologies that are not reaching people for human welfare. We have high unemployment, and so forth. So in a common sense way, this system, however successful it's been, cannot be considered optimal. And the question, and the only justification for new theory is there some way, or do we have greater degrees of freedom to improve upon it? And very briefly, I just want to talk about three institutions. The first, the market, because Thomas has done such a good job of raising issues, I'm just going to touch on a few points about the market. Market is essentially a networking device, just the way language is a networking device. Without language, we can't communicate. Society doesn't exist. Market is an effective instrument to bring people together who have capacity to produce and capacity to consume, and to utilize all of the capacities of the society. But when we credit the growth of the economy over 200 years and say it's because of a market economy, we miss out on the fact that this is one part of an integral social system, or I prefer not even social system, but an organism, which has been growing and developing in all respects. I might argue that democracy has been as an important a contributor, or greater importance, than economy to the rising living standards in the world. Because if we'd had all the technologies we've applied in the last 200 years under the old system, we'd have far greater inequality than we have today, and far higher levels of poverty. But fundamentally, apart from the system, society is a vast reservoir of resources. Not just physical resources, human energy, human capacity, human knowledge, human skill. And the question is, are we really utilizing those human resources, those capacities, in an optimal way for the benefit of society? Last year, I addressed the Ukrainian business community at International Economic Summit. And in places like that, it's very obvious to us that the social institutions, the human resources, we are not producing optimal results. I think we can say the same thing in every country today, and the most prosperous. So it's not a question of something is bad, it's a question is what thought, what conception can help us utilize more of our human potential to get a more optimal result in terms of welfare and well-being for everyone. And the market, as Thomas has shown, there's a lot of scope for redefining what the market is or how it works, what it produces, and I would argue that it could produce much more than it does now, as well as distribute that much better. It's not just a question that we may pre-distribute rather than redistribute, for which there are real problems, but we're not really optimally utilizing human capacities to meet human needs. For example, in the field of education or in the field of healthcare. It's not just a question of distribution. We're not utilizing the social potential fully. And I would argue we can never utilize it fully because it is a self-multiplying mechanism that the more we tap it, the more it's growing in potential. So what's missing now, instead of a fighting between more public debt or more human welfare or more growth, if we go back to the social basis, we'll find there are vast underutilized potentials that are not being tapped. The implication of this, we talk in economics about the efficiency of the market, but when you look at economic activity from the point of view of society, what is economically efficient may be very inefficient in terms of meeting social needs. And so if we're going to have an efficient market theory, I would argue it should be efficient in maximizing human welfare, not efficient in utilizing at the level of the firm to produce the maximum profit out of the minimum raw materials and in space and time. The market has succeeded because it promotes values, universal values of individual freedom, self-reliance, innovation, and creativity, which are a natural counterpart to democratic freedoms. But we also know it fosters another set of values that are competitive, conflicting, that foster inequality, promote insecurity, ecological imbalances, and individualism. And what I mean by individualism is not the development of the individual, but the idea of every person working for themselves, rather than every person contributing in the most constructive way in the society. So as an assessment, market has done tremendous things for the society, but not in isolation, in combination with all the other social institutions that have developed over the last centuries. Without regulation, and I think we all understand this, that market lacks moral discrimination. It's prone to short-termism, unhealthy imbalances, and cancerous growth, and even creating black holes where it draws everything into a particular place. We call it a monopoly or a center of power. So there's no reason to conclude that the way the market's functioning today is optimal. The second institution I'd like to talk about is money. And money is also a networking institution. Money itself has no more value than the particular sound that I'm making. The sound of the words I'm making only have value because you know what we have a shared meaning for those words. If I take $1 billion on a desert island where I'm alone, my money is worthless. It's only useful in relationship to other people. Economics focuses primarily on the economic value of money, or the economic power that money has for buying goods and services. But I think when we reflect socially in society, there's a vast power of money that is not directly related to the production or purchase of goods and services at all. And it takes many different forms. It can buy political power, as we well know. It can give you access to anything that society has to offer, not just goods and services. It can give you access to the president and prime minister of a country. It can give you access to the public and popularity or notoriety and so forth. And I don't think we've fully understood the significance of the social power of money, not just in the narrow sense of that money can be used in corrupt ways, or money can be used to distort political processes, but what is really the basis that gives money power in society? If we look at it, I think the answer lies in the fact that money is a symbol. It's not a thing, it's a symbol. And it's a symbol nominally for products and services and anything I can want to buy that the society can produce. At a deeper level, the money is a symbol for the productive capacities of the whole nation, or of which the money represents. Its natural resources, its technological capacities, its political institutions, its legal system, its capacity for self-defense, it's the rights that it gives to people. It's a symbol for all of these because money has the capacity to enable us to convert one into the other. If you have money, you can generate education, you can improve health, you can strengthen your defense. The money itself represents all other types of social power. But if we take it one further level, and that's where I was trying to go, the real value of money depends on something very subjective, very subtle. and that is the faith and trust and confidence that the public has, not only in the currency, in the government, in the society itself. So the fundamental foundations of money are the value that we give to the society, the faith we have in the society. And I don't have time to illustrate it, but there are very striking illustrations in history, like what FDR did to address the banking crisis in 1933, when he really understood that what was undermining the system was a loss of trust and confidence in the fundamentals of the society. Well, what's the implication of this? The implication is that the amount of money, today we have a debate in Europe and elsewhere in the world, there's only so much money the government can create or utilize because of the implications that it has for indebtedness. And we have some magic numbers as what is the valid proportion of GDP that you can have as your accumulated debt. But if we really look at a deeper level as to what money represents in the society, I think we'll see this as a very arbitrary notion, at least one worth serious discussion and debate. The third and final issue I'd like to take up is the issue of social power. And the minister brought it up so well, and a number of the other speakers did, that to my great pleasant surprise, that I think that it's already been introduced. But I'd like to use the term social power in a little different sense, because when we use the term, there's a kind of a connotation that power refers to who uses power for their own purposes. But let's look at power in a more generic way. The power in society is the power we have to accomplish results. Any results in the society. Today, modern society has a capacity for a power for communication, a power for transport, a power for education, a power for entertainment, a power for scientific research and innovation. All of these are powers of the society that we utilize to accomplish results which hopefully are intended for the welfare of the society. The real question is, are we fully utilizing the powers that society has, and what are the factors that limit our capacity to utilize those powers? And then we come into the second use of the term power, which really refers to how that power is distributed, who's controlling that power, and for what purposes. So the forms of social power are many, whether it's to defend ourselves, or governance, or rule of law, or R&D, or education, whatever it means. And all of these forms are also interconvertible. Money is only one of the instruments. If you have education, you can do the research, you can generate better governance, and so forth. But the distinction between the social potential for accomplishing results and the actual result accomplished depends on how that power is distributed. And I'd make a statement. Let's look at democracy. Today, the individual in a functioning democracy has more power for fulfilling his needs than probably even the monarch had 200 years ago, when all the power was centralized. We see that as power has been distributed politically, the overall power in the society has gone up. Because it was not a zero-sum game of if you have power, I don't have it. We found practically in society that the more widely we distribute power, the more power is created in the society. The more human creativity, the more human initiative is developed. And there's the principle behind the market economy too. The more freedom we give to people, the more creative and productive they become, and therefore, at least within certain limits, the greater the economic results are there. So I'm raising a question. What is the optimal formula for the distribution of social power, of which money is one form? If we look at the experience of history, I would say the optimal distribution is a distribution that distributes the maximum power to each individual. Of course, that's not the maximum power for every individual to dominate over every other individual. That would be the maximum degrees of freedom, like Amartya Sen talks about, for each individual to promote their own welfare. And I think it's very clear that the present system, which is not optimal in many other respects, is certainly not optimal in the distribution of social power. And there are many barriers to that. A number of them have been mentioned before. I'm not intending to go through them. Some of them, as Thomas was indicating, are inbuilt into the laws and precedents of how we do things. Things we take for granted when we talk about an economy, how a market system works. We don't think about how much power in the past has gone into framing patent laws or property rights. If I own a piece of land, I own all the resources under that, at least in the US, not everywhere, down to the center of the earth. But I can't claim the space up to the moon, because by some convention we've decided that the space above my property I don't have ownership of. Airplanes can fly over it, satellites can go over it, but somehow I have a claim to everything that's beneath the surface of the property. These are arbitrary rules which need not be the way they are. So, So my point in raising, and I know I've raised a lot in a few minutes, and maybe not as clearly as I should, but social theory and economic theory, if we ignore the power equation, I think we cannot be seriously talking about valid theory, whether it's in economics or in any other sphere. Economics is all about how power is generated and how power is distributed. And all I'm arguing for is not a particular configuration. I'm arguing that we need to make that explicit, because we have power over things only when we're conscious of them. And as the moment we press it below the surface and say, this is an externality, I think we are denying ourselves the degree of freedom to make the system better. So in conclusion, this is Thomas's point, the laws of economy are human-made. We're not dealing with natural laws. This is not Newtonian economics. And therefore, no matter how good this system is, I don't think any of us can argue it's optimal. We can do better, and it's not just a trade-off between this or that. We can produce more for everybody, of everything, and more welfare, at least, for everybody, if we are willing to look at it at social foundations. The economic performance of an economy depends on every other aspect and dimension of the society: government, law, education, and every other dimension. And therefore, we're arguing that any real new economic theory has to broaden the discussion and look at the contributions of every other science, social science, to where economy fits in to the overall integrated whole that we call a social organism. As I've said, no society effectively, fully harnesses and utilizes the social potential. If they do, then we ought to quit where we're here. But I think we're just in the beginning. And the distribution of social power is one, not the only, but one critical ingredient of that. And we're looking to work and looking to partner. We already have 50 people involved and about 19 organizations. We're looking to partner with anyone who has a contribution to make on any of these dimensions that will help us understand how to build a more optimal social system in future. Thank you.